Today's topic is the medieval esoterica, what survives from the ancient world that still has. I've picked things that with the Cathars and the Kabbalah that still have their roots in what we've been talking about heretofore. So this whole tradition of secret knowledge as it makes it into the Middle Ages. We're going to begin, however, with something that I didn't list here, but that has an impact on everything that's happening in this period. And that is this penchant for millennialism, beginning as early as the actual millennium, the year 1000. There were all sorts of people using the apocalypse and or using other biblical references to argue that the last days were coming. And indeed, some of the fervor that went into the early Crusades, which begin at the end of the 11th century. The First Crusade is called in 1096. Some of the fervor that went into that has this millennialist spirit. We've got to cleanse the world of the infidels because the Lord is returning on a flaming chariot, sort of thing. The one man that makes the most of this and touches on some of the themes we've looked at is Joachim of Fiore, or Gioacchino da Fiore, is a 12th century figure, an Italian from southern Italy, who, as many of these religious reformers in this period, is someone that begins in a bourgeois family with a newly bourgeois background. His father was an Italian notaio, and a notary in Italy was always someone of stature. And this is in the South, in Calabria. But as is typical, and this will characterize St. Francis, this will characterize several of the reformer figures that we get in this period. This person born into comfort has spiritual yearning, and it moves him towards pilgrimage to the Holy Land, towards mystical conversions, towards a turning away from what in the monastic tradition has always been called the world. And the monastic tradition, beginning with the Egyptian monks in the 3rd century and moving through the Benedictines and the Cistercians as we get into the Middle Ages, the contrast was always between the ascetic world, which was called the desert. The Egyptian monks were always going off into the desert, as Christ went into the desert to meditate, as the Jews had to go through their dark night of the soul in the desert. And it was always contrasted with this emerging world of wealth, this bourgeoisification of Western Europe that occurred in the 11th and 12th centuries. So he lived as a wandering hermit and a preacher for several years until it began to catch the eye of the church authorities, who never liked free agents wandering around drawing followings of their own, and steered him into an abbey, made sure that he became a priest. Let's get this guy under our thumb. Let's get him institutionalized, where he became obsessed with biblical studies. And there he wanted to understand. He read scripture, believing, as all of the people we've been looking at heretofore believed, that there's an inner meaning, a concealed arcane layer of scripture that needs proper translation and unpacking. And in particular, the book of Revelation, otherwise known as the Apocalypse, the the evangelist John's book about the last days, the four horsemen of the apocalypse coming to purge the world of its final and last stain of sin. And it's rife with, of course, imagery and symbols, that are evocative of all sorts of things that someone looking for inner meaning would be drawn to. He emerges from his studies with a theory of three ages, as it's called. He saw in the apocalypse a prophetic key into, of all things, the structure of history. History was a continuum. It was not cyclical. It had direction. He proposed a golden age that was going to be in the near future, in which the church would no longer be necessary. It would be absorbed. All peoples and religions would unite, Christian, Jews, and Muslims, almost like Mani, assuming that there was going to be the melded belief system of the true God. And his three ages were the age of the Father, which he saw as pretty much coextensive with the Old Testament and the tradition of Torah, the period of the law, that was replaced with the coming of Christ, the first coming of Christ, as the age of the Son. It's the age of the New Testament, which he thought, remember, and he's saying this in about the year 1180, he's saying it's going to end in 1260. He was one of these early people naming a year when it was going to happen. And there would be the appearance at that point of an Antichrist, because an Antichrist is predicted by the apocalypse, a kind of satanic figure, who the proto-Protestant reformers of the late Middle Ages, and then the Protestant reformers after Martin Luther, identified with the Pope, that the Pope was the Antichrist. But that this would then usher in the final age of the three ages, and that would be the age of the Holy Spirit, a new utopian age of universal love. In this new and final age, an eternal gospel would be revealed as fulfilling and replacing the organized church, which would then disappear. A new order of the just would usher in a reign of enlightenment and freedom. This apocalyptic theology had a great influence on other millennialist movements that existed over the next century. This diagram on the right from the book of figures, the Liber Figurarum, shows a diagram of the three ages as he planned them out, each overlapping just a little bit. He was never himself condemned by the church. He stayed just barely on the good side of the canon lawyers who did not declare him a heretic, much the same way that Francis of Assisi managed to stay on the good side of the inquisitorial powers that be. But his theories were easily applied to esoteric readings that predicted a golden age or a rapture. So if you look, I excerpted a bit from his commentary on Revelation. An angel seized the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil or Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. He threw him into the abyss and locked and sealed it over him to keep him from deceiving the nations anymore until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be set free for a short time. The just came to life, a resurrection, and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy are those who have part in the first resurrection. The second death has no power over them, but they will be priests of God and of Christ and will reign with him for 1,000 years. So this ushers in, along with a group that I'll mention in the next paragraph, the Valdensians, it ushers in this age of new heresies, if you will. Several groups emerge in the 11th and 12th centuries, preaching apostolic poverty, always criticizing the church and church wealth and the church hierarchy for being the fatted calves, if you will. And groups that do this are the poor men of Lyon, otherwise called the Valdensians because of their leader, Peter Valdo. I'm going to mention them specifically in a bit. The Brethren of the Free Spirit, the Almaricians, the Dulcinians, little pop-up groups, all of whom were led by some inspired reformer who says the end is coming. Let's live like the apostles. Let's live in poverty. Let's live in a community of shared goods. We don't need the domination of priests over us or of a hierarchy. They have many things in common. We should have access to Scripture directly. Who are these priests that they should lord it over us in this way? The hierarchy was considered corrupt and a clear sign that the Antichrist was in the wings because it had been predicted by the book of Revelation. Is it the Pope? Some are going to say yes. Certain radical followers, even of Francis of Assisi himself, styled themselves the Joachimites and joined these movements. So the Franciscans, which were a reformed order, a new preaching order within the Catholic Church, spawns groups that are declared heretics and are always suspicious because their regard for individual poverty, apostolic poverty, sounds too much like these other New Age groups in the 11th century and 12th century. So, to set the big picture, a militant church already preaching crusades against the infidel Muslims saw these upstart groups as heretics that required an aggressive response. So the church itself has been marshaling its forces as a new militant center because of the Holy Land, but it's going to have a social presence in the world, in the West, as we're about to encounter. Now, this is where it's really going to come to bear with the rise of the so-called Cathars. So I've called this slide Paulicians, Bogomils, and Cathars. Essentially, despite the heavy suppression in the late Roman Empire when the Christian emperors emerged after Constantine, Manichaean groups and Gnostic groups survived in pockets all the way through the late Middle Ages, or early Middle Ages, excuse me, through the Byzantine Empire in the Greek world, and through the Abbasid Caliphate in Western Asia, in Baghdad. So between the 7th and 12th centuries, groups with roots in Manichaeanism and Gnostic versions of Christianity moved westward. They have their historical moments and they trigger severe political and ecclesiastical reaction. So if you look, I'm going to blow this map up a little bit so you get a better picture. So the Paulicians are going to come westward. They have pockets in what is now Turkey, east of Smyrna. in that area of the world that is still contested between the Byzantine Greeks and the Turks, the newly arrived Seljuk Turks, soon to be the Ottomans. And these beliefs, Paulician groups, make it to the Bulgarian border, the northern border. The Greek emperor, the Byzantine emperor, sees that transporting these guys northward might be a good buffer zone against the Bulgars, where they become known as the Bogomils. And then later on in the 12th century, they make their way into northern Italy and sections of what will be France, but with a real presence in what is Provence. So the Paulicians, if we look at this box on the right of the slide, they're active in the Byzantine zone, particularly Armenia, in the late 7th century, and they briefly managed to establish their own state before moving to the border with Bulgaria. Playing off the Byzantines against the Muslims, they survived until the 12th century. They're triangulating, eventually being absorbed by Christian groups or by the Ottomans, depending who's dominant in whatever region they find themselves in. The Bogomils are active in the Balkans from the 10th century to the late 14th. They make it all the way to the late 14th. They're an amalgam of Paulicians and a group aiming to reform Bulgarian Orthodoxy, the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, and the region dominated by Roman Catholicism. Do you know the Balkans are largely Orthodox, Greek, Russian, Bulgarian Orthodox, but on the far west, they're Latin Church. So in what the successor groups to Yugoslavia, the Croats are Roman Catholic, whereas the Serbs and Macedonians and whomever are Orthodox Christian. So in the region dominated by Roman Catholicism, they were subject to anti-heresy crusades when the Inquisition arrived. Now, the Cathars, who were going to start calling, I only want to call them the Cathars, to make their name consistent with what they thought of themselves as in the ancient world. They are going to be called, because of their presence around the southern French town of Albi, they're going to be called historically the Albigensians. The Cathars were active in northern Italy, France, and the Languedoc within Provence from the 12th to the late 14th century. As the Albigensians, they were the catalyst for the most extreme excesses of the Inquisition and more, as we will see. Now, to give us a kind of cultural and political backdrop, in the 12th century, when Cathars are making their way into the Languedoc, if you look on the left map, this is a map of the Angevin possessions in the 12th century. So everything that is brownish to reddish is being controlled by, if you will, the same family from Anjou that become the kings of England. The French monarchy, the King of France, the royal domain of France, is that dark green central area up in the northeast, just that little blob of very dark green, are surrounded by the lighter green, which are vassals of the King of France, but with no direct control to the south. The south is controlled by the Angevins, by the Count of Toulouse. This political balance act is not going to last, and it's not going to last in large part because everyone is trying to consolidate power And the presence of the Albigensians is going to give the King of France the opportunity to make a move on the south of France. Now, if you look on the map on the right, this is a language map, if you will. So I should blow this up. So there are dialects of Proto-French in all the green areas, greenish to yellowish areas in the north, and there is a Savoyard language of sorts in the blue area in the east, and the reddish areas pretty much represent the spoken languages of the Languedoc, which literally means, or Occitania, as it's sometimes called, which literally means the language where oc is used as the word for yes, as opposed to the Languedoc, which would be the dialects in the north where we becomes the word for yes, or in northern Italy, which would be, they would have called the long C, where C becomes the word for yes. So Franco-Provençal and those blue areas. Now, understand that in this period of what we like to call France, and this period of what we like to call northern Italy and Spain, dialects were every 30 miles. There would have been a scattering of 50, 60, it would have been like 19th century India. There would have been 50 languages in a region until you get these political consolidations asserting dominant vernaculars in particular areas. The reason I emphasize this language and cultural distribution is that the intellectual center of Western Europe was in the Languedoc, in the areas of Toulouse and the Angevin possessions. These were where the courts emerged that developed all the new thought. And the next slide will explain it. In the 12th century, southern France, the Languedoc, was a hotbed of intellectual, cultural, and religious creativity. So this region became a center for irregular movements that challenged church orthodoxy and traditional mores. So, as we will see, this is where the Cathars settle. As we will see, this is where Kabbalah gets developed. As we'll see, this is where chivalry and the tradition of and the literature of courtly love and the romantic visions of knighthood get developed. This is the area where the Christian heresies arguing a criticism of the church for its wealth and corruption and hierarchical control all are based. So first, the courtly love bullet. The romantic ideals of chivalry were quickly elaborated into an ornate set of behavioral and literary conventions that flourished at the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was the queen consort of France and England and the mother of Richard the Lionheart, the Coeur de Lion, and the court at Poitiers became famous as the court of love. On the religious side, the proto-Protestant groups criticizing the church completely flourish in Provence. So the poor men of Lyon, as they're called, when they, under their leader, they wind up migrating to Lombardy, where they have a tremendous presence as an ascetic movement begun by Peter Valdo, who's, you see, overlaps well with Gioacchino da Fiore. And these strike the signature notes of the age. Their message, this message of poverty, has particular appeal for a newly created bourgeoisie. And these were the bourgeois centers. These were the regions of Europe where the new cities were growing, the new towns were growing apace, much faster than in the European South, for instance, or in the European far north. Because this new bourgeoisie is well aware of its own competence as business people and is very resentful of a traditional, lazy, and usually undereducated priesthood. So what flourishes in these regions? Anti-clericalism, anti-sacramentalism. What do we need priests for? We don't have priests. The sacraments are mumbo jumbo. Voluntary poverty and a demand, since they regarded themselves as competent, that books should be written, the scripture should be written in their own languages. So this is the period in which the words of consecration at the Mass, hocus enim corpus meum, got morphed by the wags of the period as hocus enim corpus meum, a bunch of hocus pocus. And here in this painting of Giotto from the period, Christ casting out the money changers, 1305. It is a Christian violation for the church to be involved, for religion to be involved in the world of money. So into this world, into this hotbed of new ideas, walk the pure ones. Katar is from the Greek kataroi, the pure ones, in the perfect. They called themselves perfecti or parfait. In the 12th century creative atmosphere of Languedoc, the Cathars, or good Christians, as they styled themselves, or Albigensians, because of their stronghold in Albi, arrived with a message that took the appeal of the Valdensians to another level. They divided into ordinary believers and an inner elect of parfait, or parfait, who led extremely ascetic lives, yet still worked for their living, generally in itinerant manual trades like weaving. This is really what I say in the next sentence under that theology bullet. Cathar theology took the basic outlines of Manichaean Gnostic framework, and it was really the Manichaean framework, as refracted through medieval Catholicisms. So you take Manichaeanism as we looked at it in the 3rd century, and you launder it through a medieval Catholic view of the world for 900 years, and this is what emerges on the other side. So they maintained the tenet of the two gods. Now it's the good God of the New Testament who created the spiritual world, and the evil God, Satan, who created the material world. Since the body was material, several Catholic beliefs and practices had to be jettisoned. Christ's body, therefore, since it was a body, had to be an illusion. So out go the incarnation and the resurrection. The sacraments of the Mass, because they were physically implemented, you were baptized with water, you ate the bread and drank the wine, the body and the blood, were useless since they had physical elements. Well, that really can't be the body of Christ. He didn't have a body. And procreation, very Manichaean, was tainted since it trapped the spiritual in the physical. So their one sacrament, if you will, their one great ritual was the consolamentum. Human souls were regarded as the sexless spirits of angels trapped in the material realm and destined for reincarnation. They go from body to body unless they had achieved salvation or perfection, as it was called, through the consolamentum, a ritual performed right before death. This picture on the lower right depicts a consolamentum from the brothers. Living a pure anti-material life, of course, would be a burden. Trying to live like one of these perfect ones, these parfaits, would be onerous. In addition to dietary constraints, they never ate meat. The ordinance against sexual contact was particularly onerous. So the whole idea of the last minute consolamentum was thought to spare the individual from living such a difficult regimen. So you sort of muddle your way through the world. And then before you go, you get the consolamentum, your one-way ticket straight to perfection. So there was a kind of cynicism built into it, perhaps. Who knows? Morality, as was the case with other anti-church sects, such as the Valdensians, the Cathars were strict about biblical moral codes. So there were the usual injunctions against killing, lying, swearing oaths, but most notable was their observance of apostolic poverty. Women could be promoted in the Cathar world. So the key Cathar social distinction was between the perfect elect and ordinary believers, not between men and women. Cathar women could become perfect and assume leadership roles, even owning their own houses. Procreation was abhorrent, and marriage was not a highly respected social institution, which leads to very odd results. And documents that I'm going to talk about in a little bit, we find that sometimes people led fairly promiscuous lives outside of marriage, or even if they were technically married, despite the institution of marriage, intending on the last minute consolamentum. It wasn't like they were considering or committing a great sin. The attitudes towards sexuality led to this odd side effect, but logical ramification. There were no doctrinal barriers to contraception, euthanasia, or suicide. Non-procreative sex, this is the odd flip, was preferable to procreative sex. So marriage, it was better if you were doing something that wasn't going to lead to making children, including masturbation and homosexuality. One of the names Catholics gave to the Cathars was boob, or what emerges into modern lingo as bugger in English. They said, well, these people are practicing God knows what. They very well may have been. It catches on the movement, oddly enough, in this region of the Languedoc. In fact, if we look at this map in the lower right, the one thing missing here is a border line. Apparently, a lot of Albigensians moved back and forth between Aragon and the Languedoc, depending on how aggressive the Inquisition was being in the Languedoc. Sometimes people would leave Carcassonne or Béziers, or Albi, which were real, Narbonne, which were real centers, and they'd cross the border just to stay out of the reach and come back, in the spring kind of thing. But the movement really caught on because Cathar piety looked pretty good, in stark contrast to that of the typical parish clergy. So the movement spread like wildfire between 1150 and 12,000. This is the same period, by the way, that Cistercian monks were creating monasteries all over France at the same time. There is a movement towards piety, but out among, the shepherds and the small town burghers, where a monastery was not likely to be established, the Cathar option seemed like a something that was easily choosable. The moral persuasiveness of communal property, gender equality, and apostolic resolve to accept death for one's faith. These people went down with the ship, and it was shocking to the inquisitors, was compelling. So these people were good witnesses to what they believed in, and their sacrifices convinced other people that it was worth adopting. Now, and this is where the political and the religious join. A crusade is called by the Pope. As the sect grew in strength and attracted support among the Provençal nobility, it drew support. Pope Innocent III reacted decisively and called for a crusade that had to bypass the local nobles, offering the lands of Cathar heretics, once that means the nobles, to any French nobleman willing to take up arms. So the Pope, using an obvious card, pretty much announced to the French royal house in the north, if you want to come as the temporal arm of an internal crusade, not a crusade against Muslims in the Holy Land, but a crusade against infidel in Provence, not only do you have our blessing, but you can keep the lands. So this had a profound effect in the tilting of the control of what we think of as the modern country of France to the French monarchy because of this religious campaign, the famous Albigensian campaign. King Philip II of France seizes the opportunity with a vengeance. So between 1180 and 1230, there is a savage suppression of the Cathars as French crusaders, among them the notoriously bloodthirsty but capable and efficient Simon de Montfort led the charge. So a bunch of French thugs get to descend on the south of France. The groundwork was laid for the eventual absorption of the Languedoc into France, and indeed the language is gone. The Provençal speak French. Now, in the military phase of the crusade, whole cities were besieged and the inhabitants slaughtered. It was a veritable genocide that took place. It's been estimated that the majority of the town of Béziers were killed, Catholics along with Cathars, and a chronicle of the event quotes, "Sir, what shall we do? For we cannot distinguish between the faithful and the heretics." The abbot, like the others, was afraid that many, in fear of death, would pretend to be Catholics, and after their departure would return to their heresy, and is said to have replied, "Kill them all, for the Lord knows his own." The Lord will figure it out. So I included some images taken from the period of the sack of Béziers. Cathars being expelled from Carcassonne, 1209. Innocent III excommunicating Cathars, and there's a massacre over here. So this vicious campaign, and of course, this is the birth of what we've come to call the Inquisition. Long before the Spanish Inquisition, this was the first of the ignominious inquisitions. The Albigensian Crusade, established by a papal commission, bypassing local authorities, nobles, bishops, municipal councils, it was extremely unpopular, even among Catholics. Inquisitors would be sent to towns and villages to question locals and trace the sources of heretical ideas. So imposed from outside, these interlopers would come and man the Inquisition. Torture was developed as one of the famous tools of the Inquisitors. Procedures were developed that would almost guarantee guilt or the admission of guilt. Instruments of torture, like crusaders' weapons, were routinely blessed with holy water. A contemporary document stated the obvious. Under these constraints, they affirm as true what is false, preferring to die once than to be thus tortured multiple times. Anything to get out from under. Now, in order of priests and preachers, in fact, calling themselves the Order of Preachers, was invented in this period by the ex-army man, St. Dominic. And it was organized as a military order, trained as preachers to be the stormtroopers of the Inquisition. And they could counter heresy on the theological level because they were educated, not sort of the intellectually inferior parish priests that were in place. And their moral probity could compare with the perfecti, since they were living lives of poverty themselves and in communal lives. Their military discipline was suitable for rigorous questioning and, of course, physical ordeals. I mentioned in this box on the lower left that the Spanish Inquisition used St. Dominic and the Albigensians as propaganda. So the Spanish Inquisition, which was used against Jews and Arabs in Spain in the 15th century, not expelling them ultimately until 1492, organized by the famous General Inquisitor Tomás de Torquemada, who commissioned these panels on the right, propagandistic panels. And here's St. Dominic himself presiding over a putting to death of Cathars. Here he is again, people being put on the brazier. So this was a model for what the Spanish Inquisition itself was willing to do. Now, I want to mention this famous document called the Fournier Register. Later on in the period in question, in the early 14th century, between 1318 and 1325, the Bishop of Pamiers, Jacques Fournier, Monsieur Jacques, as he was called, conducted an inquisition against the last remaining Cathar believers in the village of Montailleux. He was truly interested, he was an interesting man, in understanding what these poor townspeople thought, because they were usually not extensively educated people themselves. He wanted to know what made them tick, and became famous for having a light touch and his skill in questioning. He very rarely used torture of any kind. He conducted each interview himself, and stenographers, under his instruction, kept detailed records of the interrogations. And guess what? We have those. We have this treasure trove for modern historians, and it became a flashpoint in the late 1960s and early 1970s. there was one of the critiques of the people doing history of the Middle Ages was that it's always the history of the classes that had voices, the aristocracy, uh, the educated, the wealthy, and that you never got a picture from below. And how can we write a history of the people who are below, uh, who don't really have a historical presence until like the 18th century, when their voices can be heard? Here was this treasure trove. So a famous French historian named Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie wrote a book. It's been translated into English. I can't recommend this book enough. It's a magical book. Montailleur, The Promised Land of Error. Basically, it reconstructs the life of this village through 500 interviews, interrogations that were documented in detail, word for word. And so the personalities of these people, who were usually shepherds, one was the local priest, emerge through the text. It's this wonderfully anomalous peek into the world of people who are otherwise not represented on the historical scene. So the bulk of Fournier's interrogations relied on subtle questioning rather than bullying. People were encouraged to speak freely and openly, and they did. And here's a sample, just to give you a little bit of a flavor. This is from 1320. It's the Confession of Beatrice, widow of Otho L'Église of Dalou. When I asked him, how can it be that God has created such a quantity of men and women if so many among them will not be saved? He replied that only the good Christians will be saved and no other, neither religious nor priest nor anyone, with the exception of the good Christians. Indeed, he said, just as it is impossible for the camel to pass through the eye of a needle, so it is possible that those who have riches will be saved. It is because of this that kings and princes, prelates and religious, and all those who have riches will not be saved. Only the good Christians. They remain in Lombardy because they do not dare to live here, where the wolves and the dogs persecute them. The wolves and the dogs are the bishops and the preaching friars, the Dominicans, who persecute the good Christians and chase them from the country. He said he himself had seen and met several of these good Christians. They were such people that when one had heard them speak, one could not ever leave them. And if I myself heard them just one time, I would be theirs forever, says Beatrice. Anyhow, moving along. Kabbalah, I hope we have time. I'll try to race through this. Comes out of the same region. Now, Jewish mysticism had been around, if you will, since the prophetic period. And it continued through the Middle Ages. In fact, from the period between 200 and 700 AD, the Merkabah, the chariot tradition of mysticism, existed in certain Jewish circles, and it centered on visions of ascents to the heavenly palaces and the throne of God, using Ezekiel and Elijah's fiery chariot as a model. And people would, contemplating on those texts, try to have their souls emerge along with the fiery chariot to the heavenly palace of God. Kabbalah means reception. The 12th and 13th century saw the formalization of Kabbalah in Spain, Al-Andalus, and the Languedoc, the same region that served as the epicenter of Catharism. Mystical speculations about the nature of God, man, and creation abounded in the Jewish world. So there is in place a dominant theosophical tradition, mystical wisdom tradition running through Kabbalah. There are other traditions too. I only call it theosophical to distinguish it, which seeks to understand the divine and deeply intuitive, innate, symbolic, and imaginative ways. Man is regarded as the divine microcosm, the reflection of the larger macrocosmic spiritual world. And Kabbalah examines how human activity can redeem the cosmos, the spiritual realm. The whole of Jewish religious practice and literature is thus given a mystical and metaphysical significance. It is here to redeem the world. In the 16th century, the famous Kabbalistic sage Isaac Luria developed a system that added to the mainstream medieval Kabbalah of the Zohar, which is the major text of the earlier period. Now, there's also a meditative, ecstatic tradition that's identified with a late medieval figure called Abraham Abulafia. And his tradition strives to achieve a mystical union with God. We'll take a peek at that later on. And there's even a kind of what they call a practical magic tradition, little white magic used to, God knows, to maneuver certain things in the world. It was often considered dangerous by other Kabbalists. So we won't have a whole lot to look at there. The foundational texts are the Zohar, which means radiance, the radiance, although there had been seminal mystical works reminiscent of Kabbalah dating back to the Talmudic period. The key medieval source text of the tradition is the Zohar by Moshe de Leon, although to give it authority, he claims it was authored by Shimon ben Yochai, one of the 2nd century Talmudic sages. So although he's probably most likely the author of this, historians are quite sure he is, he wants to add authority to it by claiming it was one of the ancient masters and sages who was the author. There's the Bahir, the Book of Illumination. It's an anonymous text, again attributed to 1st century sages, but was probably written in 12th century Provence. The famous Jewish intellectual historian, Gershom Scholem, and in particular, a historian of Kabbalah, regards it as a Gnostic text, a Jewish Gnostic text, because it speaks of aeons. It has a theory of aeons, as did the emanationist theories of the Gnostics. There's the Pardes Rimonim, or orchard of pomegranates. The word Pardes also refers to exegesis or explanation, translation. It was composed in 1548 by the Jewish mystic Moses ben Yaakov Cordovero in Safed, Galilee. The Safeds are often a school of Kabbalah. This was a rational systematization of the Zohar. So he tried to systematize the principles of the Zohar. So it was a major expression of the earlier tradition. And then there is the Etz Chaim, the tree of life, and the Shamona Shearim, the 8 gates. These are texts associated with the 16th century figure Isaac Luria. The tree of life is a synthesis of Luria's teachings done by a disciple of his, Chaim Vital, who was from Calabria. And the 8 gates contain the full Lurianic system arranged by Chaim Vital's son, Shmuel. Luria's Kabbalah was regarded by his followers as a mystical corrective to the rationalistic approach of Cordovero. And it's Luria's Kabbalah is the one that modern Hasidism most identifies with. And here is a frontispiece from the first printed edition of the Zohar in the 16th century. So, what's it about? So God is seen as concealed and as revealed. The Kabbalah is a set of sacred and magical teachings meant to explain the relationship between the unchanging, eternal God, the mysterious Ein Sof or Ein Sof, the infinite, and the mortal, finite universe, God's creation. There are two aspects to God. God, in essence, is absolutely transcendent and unknowable. So again, sounding like Plotinus and the Neoplatonists, sounding like some of the Gnostics. God is absolutely transcendent, a divine simplicity beyond revelation. But God, as a revealed persona, through a manifestation through which he creates and sustains humanity, is another thing. This is the aspect of God whose emanations are accessible to human perception via revelation. And Kabbalistic documents are always filled with pictures of emanated spiritual worlds. These aspects are perceived as complementary. The emanations mystically reveal the concealed mystery from within the Godhead. So God is mystically transcendent, but can be mystically revealed through a kind of self-expression. The Zohar reads the first words of Genesis, in the beginning Elohim created, as, in their version, with the beginning, the Ein Sof created Elohim, God's manifestation in creation. So in the beginning, the transcendent God created the revealed God, in a sense. It's an emanation from himself. At the very beginning, the king made engravings in the supernal purity. A spark of blackness emerged in the sealed within the sealed. From the mystery of the Ein Sof, a mist within matter, implanted in a ring, no white, no black, no red, no yellow, no color at all. When he measured with the standard of measure, he made colors to provide light. Within the spark, in the innermost part, emerged a source from which the colors are painted below. It is sealed among the sealed things of the mystery of Ein Sof. It penetrated, yet did not penetrate its air. It was not known at all until, from the pressure of its penetration, a single point shone, sealed, supernal. Beyond this point, nothing is known. So it is called Reshit, beginning, the first word of all, from the Zohar. I'll leave you to try to make sense. The Sefirot, with two alternate spellings that they often give it. And Kabbalah, Sefirot, the tree of life. Sefirot are 10 emanations / attributes / manifestations through which Ein Sof reveals itself and continuously creates both the physical world and the chain descent of the metaphysical four worlds. And those metaphysical four worlds are the world of action and physicality, the world of emotion and relationships, the world of consciousness, thought, and intellect, the world of emanation and spirituality. The Sefirot are 10 different channels through which God reveals his will. And later Jewish literature, the 10 Sefirot referred to either to the 10 manifestations of God, the 10 powers or faculties of the soul, or the 10 structural forces of nature. So they are used as a conscious device to describe all of reality. Keter at the top describes the divine will that is beyond conscious intellect. The next three, Chochmah, Bina, and Dayat, this little triad, describe three levels of conscious divine intellect. So the Godhead is very much incorporated in the top of this tray. The 7 subsequent Sefirot describe the primary and secondary conscious divine emotions, which are paralleled by aspects of the psychology of the human soul, as we will say. The Sephirot of the left side and the Malkut in the bottom are feminine, as the female principle in Kabbalah describes a vessel that receives the outward male light, then inwardly nurtures it and gives birth to the Sephirot below them. So there's much sort of dynamism in this mysterious reality. Macrocosm and microcosm. Kabbalah sees the human soul as mirroring the divine and all creation as a reflection of its source in the Sephirot. Identifying the essential spiritual properties of the soul gives the best insight into their divine source. Therefore, the Sephirot also describe the spiritual life of man. So, two versions of it here, left and right, but let's look at the table in the middle. The Sephirot themselves, Chokhmah, which the macrocosmic aspect is wisdom, Bina is understanding, Da'at is knowledge, Chesed is kindness, Gavura is strength, Tiferet is beauty, Netzach is victory, Had is splendor, Yesod is foundation, and Malkut is kingship. Now on the right, the or microcosmic or internal aspects within the human is our reflection of that aspect within ourselves. Wisdom, selflessness, understanding, joy, knowledge, unification, kindness, love. The Hasidim call themselves Chaseds because of God's kindness in reflected in our love as the key to their spiritual lives. Strength, fear, the fear of the Lord, beauty, mercy, victory, prevail, splendor, sincerity, foundation, bonding, kingship, service. And indeed, they even can lay out the body as a microcosm which reflects the tree structure of the Sephirot. So it's a conceptual paradigm for understanding everything. Now, Isaac Luria in the 16th century adds this whole other element to the traditional Zoharic Kabbalah with his concept of tikkun olam, repairing the world. In the 16th century, Isaac Luria reinterpreted the Kabbalah of the Zohar to create the messianic concept of tikkun olam, repairing the world. And Luria's telling, creation was the result of the Ein Sof contracting, pulling into itself, making itself smaller. It contracts and forms a void. As a result of the contraction, a void is created into which the primordial man, the light Adam Kadmon, emanated lights, which are the archetypes of the Sephirot, which formed vessels to hold the light of the infinite Ein Sof. These vessels were shattered by the overload of the light of the infinite Ein Sof, and a cosmic catastrophe called the breaking of the vessels, which resulted in universal disharmony. Although the broken shards had sparks of the emanated divine light, these sparks were entrapped and shrouded in layers of darkness. So again, you get this kind of vision of the Manichaean universe, in which life is trapped in shards of darkness. The world, instead of being composed of the pristine archetypal values of wisdom, understanding, knowledge, love, judgment, beauty, etc., the Sephirot, was now formed of the broken, displaced, and obscured lights and vessels, all these fragments, light embedded in remnants of the container vessels. Primordial Adam was himself partly shattered into a multitude of individual souls. All of our souls are the shattered parts of the light Adam. We're all descended from Adam in another way here, who themselves are comprised of the same fragments that form our world, which are exiled and alienated. So repair, tikkun olam, repairing the world. The task of individual men and women is to extract those sparks they encounter in life and spiritualize them, purify them, set them apart from the shards through prayer, meditation, and good works, so as to reconstitute the Sephirot and restore the harmony of God, man, and the world. So literally, the good Kabbalist, the good Hasid, his work is to repair the world. We have agency in God's world. We just don't save ourselves. In saving ourselves and purifying ourselves and making ourselves the best that we can be, the world is repaired and becomes the best that it can be. Now, there's a lot of language play in Kabbalah, as there was, by the way, in certain Christian traditions in the 4th century AD. People like Augustine looked at the significance of biblical numbers and made a lot of them. But in Judaism, there is an extra layer because every Hebrew letter, word, number, and accent mark can be expressed numerically, can have a mystical meaning. Judaism had traditionally found significance in the actual language of the Torah, by which when I say the actual language of the Torah, I don't mean its cognitive element. I mean actually in its letters, in the words that were used. But Kabbalah created a fully articulated linguistic mysticism. Every letter, word, number, and accent mark was looked at, scrutinized for mystical meaning, and interpretive hermeneutic. Hermeneutic is an explanatory device. An interpretive hermeneutic was developed for the process. So using literal analysis, the Kabbalist Joseph ben Abraham Gikatila, here is his book, the Porta Lucis, excuse me, the Gates of Light, in the 13th century, argued, for example, that the number 10 emanated from the Tetragrammaton, which is a Yahweh in Jewish letters, I am who am, and it's those letters, the 4 letters, which are called in Greek the 4 letters, the Tetragrammaton, and that the number 10 emanates from it, which is the primitive cause and is the source of all being. So using the letter values of the Sephirot, he drew parallel references to the names of God used in Torah. So literally looking at the Jewish letters and accent marks for each of the Sephirot, Keter, Chochmah, Bina, etc. And here's the Hebrew on the left. He sees parallels in all the different names that God is given in Torah. I am, Lord, another word for Lord. El, God, Elohim, God, Havaya, Lord of hosts, God of hosts, the living God, my Lord, Adonai, my Lord, that he sees parallels in the letters and the weight of the letters when you look at them through the mystical reveal of numeric evaluation. The Sefer Yetzirah, or Book of Creation, it was written in the Talmudic period, was the source of much mystical language analysis in Kabbalah. It describes how the universe was created by 32 mysterious paths of wisdom, 10 numbers, and 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So you get the 32 mysterious paths of wisdom. In the 32 mysterious paths of wisdom, then Yah, the Jehovah of hosts, the God of Israel, the living Elohim, the King of ages, the merciful and gracious God, the exalted one, the dweller in eternity, most high and holy, engrave his name by numbers, letters, and sounds. 10 are the ineffable Sephirot, 22 are the letters, the foundation of all things. Understand this wisdom and be wise by the perception. Search out concerning it. The 10 ineffable Sephirot have the appearances of the lightning flash. Their origin is unseen. No end is perceived. The word is in them as they rush forth and as they return. They speak as from the whirlwind and returning fall prostrate in adoration before the throne. The ineffable Sephirot give forth the 10 numbers. First, the spirit of the God of the living. Blessed and more than blessed be the living God of ages. The voice, the spirit, and the word, these are the Holy Spirit. Second, from the spirit he produced air and formed in it 22 sounds, the letters. Third, from the air he formed the waters. And from the formless and void made mire and clay and designed surfaces upon them and hewed recesses in them and formed the strong material foundation. Fourth, from the water he formed fire and made for himself a throne of glory with Ophanim, Seraphim, and Cherubim as his ministering angels. So all of creation can be seen as emanated from these paths of wisdom, which are the numbers and letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Now, Abraham Abulafia, the prophet who wanted to use the Kabbalah as a way of cultivating mystical visions, which he himself was subject to, prophetic and messianic mystical visions. In a series of books, he explains spiritual processes through which an individual can achieve union. And he was a student of Sefer Yetzirah, the book we were just looking at, and that whole tradition of letter evaluation. He believed that his system of combinations and permutations of Hebrew symbols could confer a mystical prophetic status if you knew how to combine them correctly. So this following excerpt is from his book, The Or HaSechel, Light of the Intellect. There is a little manuscript version of it, or print version of it in the lower right. And this is the secret of the pronunciation when you wish to mention this glorious divine name. Make yourself right and isolate yourself in a special place so that no one will hear your voice except you. Then purify your heart and your soul from all thoughts of this world. Then imagine in that moment that your soul is separated from your body, removed from this world and living in the world to come, which is the source of the life that exists distributed in all that lives. And this awe of one who has attained such spiritual heights is a double awe, comprising the awe that comes of love of God and the awe that comes from assent. When your mind, da'at, comes to cleave to the divine mind, da'at, it puts knowledge, da'at, into you. Your mind must turn aside from itself all extraneous knowledge apart from the knowledge da'at of God, which joins you and God by virtue of God's honored and awesome name. And therefore, you must know the form of its pronunciation, and this is its configuration. There are 25 forward permutations, there are another 25 backward permutations, and he goes off into a combinatorial elaboration at that point. But take yourself apart, go through the effort of a mystical discipline, sounding much like Plotinus himself. In the last slide, transcendence and pantheism, although Kabbalah considered the Ein Sof, the unknowable Godhead, transcendent, they reinterpreted the traditional creation story with a pantheistic continual self-emanation that produced all spiritual and physical realms as successively more corporeal condensations of divine presence. So the resultant mystical paradox is that the creation is at once a divine unity and an emanated series of realms. So the unknowable God is transcendent, but is also in all things. So you get this kind of tension between pantheism and transcendence. And then on the issue of reincarnation, the unscriptural concept of the transmigration of the soul after death, Gilgul Neshamot, cycles of the soul, was introduced by medieval Kabbalists and became a major theme with Isaac Luria and the school of Safed in the 16th century. In this tradition, souls are seen to cycle through lives or incarnations, being attached to different human bodies over time, depending on their particular task in the physical world and the spiritual level of the bodies of predecessors. The concept relates to the overall cosmic rectification, the Tikkun Olam, and the historical dynamic of ascending lights. According to Chaim Vital, one who has sexual relations with an animal is reincarnated as a bat. One who commits adultery is reincarnated as a donkey. Zadikim, just men, can reincarnate as a fish because fish do not have to be ritually slaughtered before being rectified via eating. Now, I came across, and hunting things down on the web, the following anecdote, that in 2003, it was reported that two Hasidic fish cutters encountered a talking carp at a fish market in Rockland County. Quote, the story goes that a 20-pound carp about to be slaughtered and made into gefilte fish for Shabbat dinner began speaking in Hebrew, shouting apocalyptic warnings and claiming to be the troubled soul of a revered community elder who recently died. End of report. I leave you with that. Let me stop the share. And let me remove the pin.
I'm going to go see if I can find myself a talking carp. Where there's life, there's hope.
There you go.
That's intriguing.
Any questions, comments?
Hello.
Yeah.
So, what I'm grasping is that all of these movements that you're talking about were a way to, democratize the religion, or rather not democratize, but bring it to the people in a level they could understand. I mean,
yeah.
I cannot wrap my head around Kabbalah, with all the numerology and the body part mapping and all of this stuff. It just it seems so complex.
And convoluted, really. It's a stretch. I mean, obviously, it's a stretch.
It's mystical.
Yes,
The,
Donna to explain it. Right. But Donna believes in it, right?
there you go. But the thing that I really wanted to stress through all of these traditions we're looking at is how the world of ordinary experience is regarded as insufficient or is regarded as a veil of Maya that you have to look through to find something that is arcane and really important, that there's something of ultimate value built into things, but it's never obvious on the surface. You always have to look deeper and through. It's the world of, that's why I called it mystery.
And there's always someone setting themselves up as the teacher, as the leader.
That's right.
You follow me and I'll show you
That's right.
how to figure this out.
That's right.
No reference to anyone living at the moment, but that's okay.
There you go. And I suppose that it is an aspect of almost all religion to have some element of that there's something at the heart that is mysterious and hard to fathom. Anyhow, next week,
Okay.
I'm looking at Renaissance traditions where the same themes get continued, but morph into other wild ways of looking at the world. And of course, when we get to the Renaissance and the educated classes within the Renaissance, some of the traditions of old wisdom are now abetted by real scientific discovery. In other words, what we'll see is the famous early astronomers were also all astrologers. Early physicists were also alchemists. There was no reason for them to disregard what we think of as bogus traditions. There were all, if you look at someone like, as we will talk about later, but if you look at someone like Newton, who was discovering hidden explanations of laws of physics, why shouldn't they extend to alchemical possibilities? Can you imagine if you had intimated to somebody like Isaac Newton that we could protect the body by emulating disease in the body, by a vaccine, and one that was artificially constructed at that? Miracle of miracles. Anyhow, as soon as this gets posted, I will also send out the cumulative slide deck. And after the last class, the slide deck I sent out will be all 120 something slides that I've created.
Well, thank you, Lou. It was a revelation. That's the way.
Anyhow,
See you.
Next week, if not next year, in Jerusalem, okay?
Okay. Adios.